Oh, oh God. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Gabes here. This is the normal raid guide for Garrosh Hellscream, the final boss in Siege of Orgrimmar. As usual, you can click on the annotations to check out the role-specific guides or just get the quick raid guide as well. So for your raid composition, you'll need the standard 2 or 3 healers and 2 tanks. Now, this fight is very lengthy, first and foremost, and it's quite a severe healing requirement, to be honest. It's appropriately difficult, and it does feel like the most difficult boss in the zone, at least on normal, so as it should be. So that said, it's tough to recommend 2 or 3 healers without knowing the raid composition and DPS and all that. We use 2 healers, and keeping in mind that we are very overgeared for this fight, we finished the fight with about 2.5 minutes on Berserk, I believe, out of 15 total. Assuming those timers are correct, which they're assumed at this point. So that said, there are situations with 2 healers that the healing becomes quite challenging, and other times in the fight where there's really very little to do. So we'll talk about those sections when we get there, and then you can decide a little bit what that means for your raid makeup. So Garrosh is very much a phased encounter. So I think the easiest thing to do to cover this fight is just to go through the phases, talk about them individually, and then we'll loop back through and talk about strategy and all that. So for the first phase, you face Garrosh in his, quote, normal form. So you can see his health is fairly low, 160 million. And during this period, he spawns wave after wave of adds that the raid has to deal with in some way, in addition to using a few basic abilities. So the first and most common ability you're going to see in this fight, and this is no exception, it starts right away in this fight, is Desecrate. This spawns a desecrated weapon at the location of a random ranged raid member. Now, it's important to note that this does not necessarily mean a player that is spec'd for ranged, so a healer or a DPS. It just means someone that is not in melee range of the boss. So melee and tank players are even valid targets for this, if they're not near Garrosh at the time. So, when Desecrate spawns, you can see it creates a weapon at the target location that has sort of a purple cloud. And this cloud is 15 yards in radius. Basically, it does heavy damage to anyone that steps in it, as you might imagine. The weapons can be attacked and killed during this part of the fight anyway. And doing so, of course, just gets rid of the weapon and the cloud. But for the most part, the way to handle this throughout most of the fight is to watch the timer, and when it's about to be cast, move the valid target players off to the side, as you saw there, so that when the weapon appears, you don't have to burst it down because it's not in your way. You can just slowly kill it off. Now, aside from Desecrate, Garrosh will use Hellscream's War Song frequently, which basically buffs all the other minions around him, increasing their damage and health by 150%. So this means that all the adds are a lot more dangerous, and really this first phase is a matter of dealing with those adds and Garrosh simultaneously while pushing him as much as you can. So you can see that the adds come out in sets of 6, essentially 3 from each doorway on the throne side of the room. You'll get all these Warbringers in these waves of 6, and then alternating between the Warbringer waves will be a single Wolf Rider that will spawn in one of the doors randomly. The Warbringers are pretty basic mobs. They should be picked up by the tank. They will use hamstring, so the tank will be slowed pretty frequently and needs to be aware of that. But for the most part, the Wolf Rider is the important target because as a shaman, it will try to heal, and you want to make sure you interrupt the casts whenever you can. Now, we did not find situations very frequently, if at all, even where the shaman healed Garrosh. He always seemed to prefer healing the other minions. That's not to say it's not possible, and certainly if the chain heal jumps from him to Garrosh or something, that's bad. But for the most part, if the Wolf Rider is far away, he seems to target himself primarily or other minions rather than Garrosh first. In any event, interrupt his heal whenever possible and kill him off. And then the last ad type is the most important on this phase, and these are Siege Engineers. Now, these will spawn 2 at a time, one on each opposite end of the room. And you can't really see them in this video because they spawn up above on the platforms overlooking the rooms on either side, either end of it. Basically, when they appear, the engineer will start channeling a 15-second cast. And at the completion of that cast, if he's not killed by that time, he will spawn the Iron Star, which is a giant rolling bomb of sorts that's hanging in a little cubby on the wall he's near. So throughout this video, in the first phase, you'll see one of these stars on the throne side of the room rolling past the entire raid and stuff. And that's basically from not killing the engineer on that side, causing that bomb to come out, basically. So, finally with Garrosh, normal difficulty, we get to see multiple strategy opportunities. Now, if you've been watching the videos I've been making for the previous fights, you'll notice that those don't really have opportunities for other strategies. But in this case, at least for this first phase, you kind of get some options here. So this first strategy for phase 1 is basically revolving around killing everything by yourself. And this is not the strategy you see in the video here, but I'll talk about this because it's a very common method to use, and it's completely valid if you want to go that way. So the basic idea is that when engineers spawn, you always have a DPS assigned to each of them, a ranged DPS, that can easily kill them within the 15-second period. They have very low health, around 700,000 or so, so it's not that difficult to kill them. You just have to be aware that you're going to have to spend a lot of your time running back and forth to get in range of the engineers. So, that said, by killing engineers every time they spawn, you never get the Iron Star balls rolling across the room. And for that reason, killing all the ads is completely up to your raid. It's something your raid will have to focus on and do entirely themselves, which is completely possible. And as I said, this is a very common method. So with this strategy, the basic goal would be to keep the boss in the center. That way, or maybe even the throne side, if you want to be a little closer to the doors, it's up to you. And when the waves of ads come out, have your tanks pick them up, tank them in the center on the boss, so you get extra AE and cleave damage on Garrosh, and then just burn the ads down as quickly as you can. The goal here is to try to kill them before Garrosh shouts, which will buff their health by that 150% and increase their damage. This is not always possible because of the timing of spawns relative to his shout timing, but that's the general goal here, is to kill them off quickly. So you'll kind of see that in this first wave. Our strategy, even though we're not doing this one I mentioned, you can see we killed 3 or 4 of them before the first shout, and then the remainder are at pretty low health. So that's the basic plan with this method. Then you would also interrupt the shaman, bring him into the center, kill him as well, while making sure your ranged assigned players are getting the engineers every time they're up. Now with this method, basically this trades off a bit of control. You have a little more control over what's going on. There's not as many scary opportunities, but it's an overall loss of DPS for your raid because you're doing more damage to the ads than is necessary with the other possible strategy. So keep that in mind, balance around what you find as your strengths and your raids and all that stuff, and compare it to the other strategy. So the other strategy that you can do for phase 1, which is the one that we ended up using, and in my opinion is the best for overall DPS purposes, is what I would call Bombs Away. And this is essentially taking advantage of the Iron Star spawns to help you DPS the ads. So, and this is, I should mention, the intended method for this fight, if that means anything to you. Based on the mechanics of the encounter, it's very clear that this is what you're supposed to be doing. So, basically, when an Iron Star spawns, which means, as I mentioned before, you did not kill the engineer for that Iron Star side, it will roll along the one half of the room, whatever half it started on. So, we are only killing the engineer to our left in this room, which is to the east, I believe. Yeah. Which means we let the Iron Star from the west spawn, and then when it spawns, it rolls along the back part of the room there by the throne and the doors, And anyone that gets touched by this will take 11 million physical damage. So, a lot. But this includes the NPCs, excluding Garrosh. So, essentially, the overall strategy here, and you'll see this play out here if you watch closely now that you know, is that our monk tank, who's in charge of ads, will pull them out into the path of the ball as it rolls past there, and he'll roll out of the way or teleport out of the way just before it gets to him, so that all the ads are still in the line of the ball. They get hit, they take 11 million-ish damage, and it does a lot of DPS. So you can imagine, like, 6 Warbringers per wave, for example, if each of them are still alive and have enough health to take the full hit of the ball, what is that, 66 million or so damage that is done for free, essentially, that you do not have to do as a raid. So that's quite efficient. Of course, the downside is it's quite dangerous for your tank that's handling those ads. There's a lot of potential damage there, especially when they're alive longer and they do more damage. And the tank has to be able to get out of the way of the ball. And beyond that, when the ball explodes, when it reaches the other end of the room, it will cast an explosion that does 2 million fire damage to everyone, but this damage is reduced the further away you are. So that is why, as a whole, our raid is kind of on the far side, opposite the end wall position where that star will explode at, so that we're taking as little damage as possible. The one player that needs to be careful about this is the person in charge of the engineer on the side where the other ball is spawning. So in this case, our Shadow Priest is the guy that's doing that, and you can't really see him on my screen very much. But when the engineer spawns, he runs down to the other end and kills that engineer, because you don't want 2 balls at the same time, because their explosions at the end will probably just kill your raid. But essentially, he just has to watch for that explosion, especially because he's going to be a lot closer many times. But that said, it's only if he doesn't come back from the engineer location quickly. Since engineers spawn at the same time, after that 15-second duration, his engineer should be dead, and he's already running back by the time the ball is shooting down there. So as long as he's fast enough, then it shouldn't be a danger, really. So that's it. That's the second possible strategy for Phase 1. Handling Desecrate is still the same, but generally speaking, a tank would pick up all the ads, perhaps excluding the shaman, depending on how you want to handle that, and then pull them into the path of the one bomb that you're letting go. And we chose the one that was near the doorway and the throne, so that it was it gave us more time, essentially, to pick up ads that were coming in, plus new ads, especially the shamans, would have to pass through the path of the bomb to make their way to us. And because of the timing of those shaman spawns, often they would just get hit automatically anyway. You should just be aware that the fire trail that you see from the bombs, it actually extends out a little further than it even looks like graphically. So basically, just be further than the halfway mark. If you drew a line halfway down the room, be further to the safe side than that halfway point, and you should be okay. So, yeah, it can be a little scary, but again, this is sort of the intended way, and it saves you a lot of DPS that you would otherwise have to do to all the ads. All right, so once the boss enters Phase 2, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit. Phase 2 is really 2 sub-phases as part of one another. And I'm going to talk about the secondary or intermission phase first, which is this corrupted realm phase you're seeing here. So about every 3.5 minutes while you're in the second phase of the fight, which is where you'll spend most of the time during this encounter, you'll be teleported as a raid into one of 3 random corrupted realms here. You can see them here. You'll always get each realm one time, so basically you can't, just get the same realm 3 times in a row. And these realms basically are some, area that you've seen in Pandaria before, a small part of that your raid has to run through and deal with a series of Shaw ads, corrupted ads, at which point, once you've killed all the ads, Garrosh becomes attackable, and you can basically fight him for a little bit before you're transported back out of this realm. the total time that you spend in a corrupted realm is a minute. And for each second that passes, Garrosh will gain energy in that realm. So here you can see I just skipped ahead, so we ported into another realm. So we all come in at the same location, and then we're just kind of all moving forward at the same time. And if you look in the sort of bottom left by my chat box there, you can see the Garrosh raid frame, and his purple bar is his corruption or his energy there. So you can see him gaining that every second that passes, his energy goes up. So the overall goal in the corrupted realm is to kill all these Shah ads on the way to Garrosh as quickly as you can, while buffing your raid so that you can better survive this follow-up phase period that he does in this Annihilate section, basically. So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about the specifics of how you go about this. So in terms of handling the corrupted realm, for now, just trust me when I say that the goal overall is to do the realm as quickly as possible, basically to reach Garrosh as fast as you can, to keep his energy level as low as possible. And I'll tell you why that is in a moment when we get to that section. That said, before you even begin this fight, your raid should be split up into 2 groups of 5 players, roughly equivalent to one another. So similar to the spoils fight almost, the way we do it is just have our first group be a group of 5 with 1 tank, 1 healer, 3 DPS, and then the same for the second group. Now this is important because in some of these realms, like the one you're seeing here, the raid itself actually has to split up completely. So one half of the raid is dealing with some ad, and the other half is dealing with another ad, and never the twain shall meet, as they say. In the other 2 realms, you're kind of always in range of one another, but there's still enemies on either side. And without some form of system, these 5 players get these enemies, these 5 players get these on the other side, it will be chaos and it will take a lot longer. So again, split up your raid, make sure everyone knows their rough side. So that group 1 for our group, for example, we always go on the right side. So here you can see we spawned in and I'm in group 1, so I'm picking up spawns on the right. Group 2 is doing the left, and so on. So with that in place, this will go a lot faster, and that'll help you quite a bit. The next thing is just to know the basic mechanics for each of the 3 different realms. So here you can see we're in the Temple of the Jade Serpent realm, and these 3 are sets of 3 Shah mobs, the larger ones. The basic mechanic for them is that they don't move. So unlike some of the other mobs in the Terrace of Endless Spring, for example, they will chase you when you attack them. So those you can sort of attack a little bit and then run forward a bit, and AE them down as you're moving along. But in the temple here, the Shah mobs leading up to Garrosh, they will stay stationary. So you have to burst them down where they stand pretty much, and then move ahead quickly. For that reason, it's a good idea to, in all these cases, use your movement boost effects so that you can move from one group to the next as quickly as possible. So here you see we're in Terrace of Endless Spring. Like I said, you can see these guys are moving. So the group moves forward, gathers in AEs as we're running. They don't have very much health. I'm kind of dodging back and forth because of another mechanic that's important in all these phases, and that is these buffs that you can gain. So there will be some of these Shah mobs will have a little glow to them, like a yellow glow. And when those die, they will drop a consumed faith, courage, or hope buff on the ground, which is just a little bubble. Depending on the size of the Shah, the size of the bubble will differ. And essentially, when a player steps into that, they'll receive a buff for the remainder of this phase that it reduces their damage by 50%. So it makes healing this phase here before you transport it out much easier because the damage on this part is really high. So if you look at my debuffs in the bottom right, I was able to get one of those buffs. Well, it's gone now, but so my damage was 50% less that I took. So the idea is for everyone, if possible, to get one of those buffs before you finish the sort of phase and get to the end. So in this final section, which is, I think it's the Temple of the Crane, right? Isn't that this place? Anyway, you can see that when you split off, you're up against just one large Shah here. And when this one dies, your entire group should try to step in the bubble that it's going to leave behind. Sometimes this is not possible. It spawns in sort of a random location. So there, I think I ninged it from most of our group. But suffice to say, the same rules apply. When the Shah dies, it's going to give a bubble that people can step in to get the buff. So beyond that, you have the final phase. Once you kill all the Shah as quickly as you can, Garrosh will become attackable. Now, he's not tanked in this period, and you're only in this period for the remainder of your minute duration, whatever you had left when you entered. But during that time, he will cast Annihilate over and over and over, and this is just targeting cone attack on a random raid member. As you might imagine, this ability is a one-shot mechanic if you get hit by it, but even not getting hit, it does crazy damage to everyone around. So it's 350,000 shadow damage to everyone in the raid. And because it goes off so frequently, as I said, the damage requirement is very high. Because of that, this phase, pretty much above all else, except maybe the very end of the fight, is the best time for raid cooldowns. So get in the habit of communicating with your raid members and using those as appropriate, your raid or heal cooldowns when needed, especially if majority of your raid did not get one of those damage reduction buffs from the Shah. So other than that, try to stay in melee range because, just based on geometry, the closer you are to the boss, the easier you can dodge the cone attack because you'll have to move less distance to get out of the cone when it's near you. And it also helps your healers, especially, like a Mistweaver Monk. For me, I can just spin around and most of the raids should be in range of that if they're in melee range, that kind of stuff. So all that stuff, clear the Shah as quick as you can, get the buffs if possible, but again, you're trying to go fast. And once you reach the end and Garrosh activates, you don't need to tank him, just stay in melee range, use your raid cooldowns, personal cooldowns, dodge his cleaves, and heal through it. Okay, so now that we've skipped ahead a bit, talked about the corruption sort of phase, we'll go back and talk about the phase 2 throne room period. And as I mentioned, this is where you'll spend most of your time in this fight. Basically, just by nature of Garrosh's health, you can see he has 420 million now. You're going to spend a lot of time in this phase, and because you only spend 1 out of every 3.5 minutes in the corruption realm phase, the other 2.5 minutes of that period are in the throne room here, dealing with all this stuff. So it's primarily about execution, and it's really a pattern of 3 different abilities. Once you get used to this pattern and handling them all properly in the appropriate manner, things will become much easier, and it should kind of all coalesce and come together quickly. So we'll just go through those in order. Now, the first of the Phase 2 trio abilities is Whirling Corruption. And when this is cast by Garrosh, he will spin around for 6 seconds and shoot out a ton of these little shadow waves that will hit anyone that they pass through for pretty heavy damage. And so he does this every half second for the 6-second duration. However, the damage is reduced the further away you are from Garrosh. So you can see here, basically what we do is we have the tank keep the boss in the middle or wherever he's at the time, and the rest of the raid, melee included, run out to a specific location and basically stack up there. That way we're far enough away that the damage is mitigated just from being away a bit, but we're stacked up so we can get efficient heals. And the stacking also helps for another ability, which we'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, as long as you know Desecrate is not coming next, and it's going to be the Whirl, then you can stack your raid up 20 or 30 yards away, whatever you're comfortable with, and the tank that's on Garrosh is the only one that has to actually take damage. Now, another common method for this ability that many raids use, we didn't find a need for it, but you can certainly do so, is to actually have the tank that's on Garrosh while he's spinning run him away from the raid. So you're just getting that distance even further. Obviously, the risk here is that that tank needs some way to survive that since they're going to be out of heal range. But if you want to lower the damage even more, that's another way you can do it. So just keep that in mind. Now, that's the basic form of Whirling Corruption. However, if you'll remember, I talked about in the corruption room phases, in the second phase of the fight, the goal in that phase overall was to get to Garrosh by killing all the Shah as quickly as possible so that you could keep his energy or his corruption as low as you can. The reason for that is empowerment of the phase 2 abilities. So when Whirl becomes empowered, not only does it spin just like it did, but you can now see that it will spawn minions of Yasarj at random player locations once it goes off. And these minions are probably the most difficult thing to handle in this fight. Certainly they require the most attention and planning. So the way that the minions work, once Whirling Corruption is empowered, which occurs at 25 corruption and beyond, I should mention. I forgot to say that. So yeah, Whirling Corruption becomes empowered at 25 corruption, and his other abilities are at 50, 75, and 100, which we'll talk about in a moment. Anyway, so once empowered Whirling Corruption starts, you can see that the purple markers will mark where a minion is popping up. So rather than stacking up exclusively like you were doing before, now your raid has to move away, but they have to spread out as those purple things spawn, because they will do damage if you're standing there when the minion appears. Now the minions themselves have some kind of interesting mechanics. The main thing to know is that when they are killed, they will heal any other minions around them to full health, and those minions will gain a stacking buff that increases their damage dealt by 200% and their max health by 200% per stack. So you can very, very quickly find yourself in a situation where you're barely killing any minions off, but the ones that are left behind are getting huge numbers of stacks because they're close together and they're healing up and all that good stuff. So we tried a number of different methods, and I'll talk about those briefly. The first that we tried that worked all right, but it was kind of chaotic, is to have everyone in the raid that has a taunt, basically taunt one of the minions out and stand in a safe location by themselves away from other minions and then kill it off. So if that player was a healer, which, I can taunt as a monk healer or paladin healer can taunt as well, that player really wouldn't be able to kill it, but they could just keep it off to the side while a ranged DPS kills it eventually once they're free to do so. This would keep all the minions separated, and therefore they wouldn't really get any buffs or heals from being close to one another. The problem we found with this method was that healers, especially players that just weren't strong DPS that had a taunt as well, couldn't really sustain threat once they taunted the mob out. So, for example, I would taunt mine out, but because I couldn't afford to just sit there and DPS it, I had to do heals during that time. I couldn't really hold threat on the guy. So often he would just run off to someone else, and around the time they're killing their own minion, their minion would explode, buff the other guy, and it would just chain out of control pretty quickly, when you got these buffed minions attacking DPS and stuff like that. So the method that we settled on that worked best for us was sort of a combination of normal tanking from your tank players plus some taunting from DPS. So basically DPS players that had a reliable taunt and that could hold threat, which were our DPS warrior, our DPS druid, our hunter, I believe. Those three players would taunt out one of the minions and do the same thing as before, just pull it off to the side and kill it on their own. They can manage the damage on themselves and kill it quite easily. But the remaining minions, of which there should be 5, I believe. I think there's 8 in total, I want to say. Those are picked up by the tanks, and as best as possible, roughly split among the tanks so that one tank is not tanking all of them, if possible. Then the basic idea is we just DPS them down like any other mob, forcing DPS through the extra healing and health that they'll gain. But this is a lot more controlled, even though the damage on the tanks can get a little scary once they start to get stacks. And we're wasting DPS because we're killing one and then the others are healing around it, getting more health, and then we're killing it again, and so on. Even in spite of those things, it was a lot more control overall, and tanks especially could do a lot of DPS as well, since they would get a lot of vengeance from that. So you can experiment with that, figure out how do you handle minions, but ultimately, that's probably the most important thing to get right, is handling the whirl, and especially the empowered whirl once the minions start spawning after 25 corruption. So the second trio ability for Phase 2 is Touch of Ysarge, or as I'll refer to it from now on, because I can't pronounce that very well, Charm, because that's what it is. It's a charm. So basically, this is cast on 2 random raid members, and they will be charmed, and basically they will start to chain cast their own version of the charm that will target other raid members. The idea being, as you see there, 2 people get charmed right there, that those players will then charm 2 new players, and those 2 players will charm 2 new players from them, and so on and so forth. Just chains out of control, essentially. So you need, as a raid, to DPS those players down to 20%, which will break the charm effect. However, you also need to interrupt their cast of the future Touch of Ysarge ability. Otherwise, they'll just charm another person, even if you damage them. So the best thing that you can do to help yourself when learning this fight, in my opinion, is to get in the habit of using actual interrupt abilities rather than using stuns or CCs to stop this cast from going off. So there you can see I targeted our rogue and interrupted his cast with my normal interrupt. And I'm sure other people were trying it too. So the point is that when this ability becomes empowered, which occurs at 50 corruption and beyond, and you will get to that point at some time in the fight, then the empowered version of Charm causes the player to no longer be CCable. Basically, they're immune to stuns and abilities like that, and thus the only way to stop them from charming someone else after they are charmed themselves is an actual interrupt ability to stop the cast. So if you get in the bad habit of using stuns and knockback, stuff like that, to prevent the casts early on, once you deal with the empowered versions and those no longer work, now you're going to be in a world of hurt, which is what we found out. So best case is just practice early and often using interrupts only to break people of those charms. The other thing you really want to do is use communication to call out which players it is you are breaking out. And that way you get at least 1 or 2 people always interrupting the same person. So you have backups and whatnot. So for example, when charms would occur in our mumble, you can hear it if you listen to our mumble fight, actually. You'll hear us calling out the names of the players that are charmed that we're targeting to interrupt. And by doing this, as long as everyone that can interrupt calls it out and does so, we basically always have both players covered. So even when we reach the empowered version of this ability, we can still just use our regular interrupts while DPSing them down to 20% health and breaking their charms pretty quickly. Other than that, the best thing you can do to help yourself deal with these charms is to stack up, usually on the boss's location, since you have tanks and melee in there as well. So the trio abilities for this phase all pretty much go one after the other. So as long as you keep track of which one's coming up next, you'll know whether it's going to be Charm and you should stack up on the boss, or whether it's going to be Desecrate, you should move to the sides, or whether it's going to be Whirling Corruption, you should stack up kind of far away from the boss. So once again, here you can see a Charm. This time it was on me. So players just interrupt me and DPS me down, and once I hit 20%, I'm broken free. Now, it's not really worth worrying about so much, but it is possible to kill players within that charm period before the game realizes that you're dead. And I think it's typically players that have weaker defenses, like monks, for example, because it happened to me, and I think one other time we saw it as well. So just be aware of that. You do want to DPS the player down 20% quickly, but if there's at all any lag, it's possible to burn them so fast that the game doesn't notice in time and they just die. It may also be something like if you get one shot, basically you're at 25% and something hits you so hard that you go from 25 to 0. Maybe that would do it as well. I don't know. But anyway, just something to be aware of. So that's the charm. Just stack up when it's time for that to go out so you can be in range of everyone, DPS them down quickly, call out and mumble or vent who it is you're interrupting, and use actual interrupts rather than stuns, because you will not be able to stun later on. So the final trio ability for phase 2, you're used to, you've seen it before, is Desecrate. So it works just the same as it did before. He'll throw a weapon at a random player at range, and ideally you want to put these on the side of the room when they're coming out, so that the middle, or where the boss is, that kind of area, is free for gathering up for DPSing or charms or the Whirling Corruption, especially when you start to get minions spawns from that. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. Now, because this is phase 2, this trio ability also has an empowered version. In this case, empowerment of Desecrate occurs at 75 corruption and beyond. So chances are you will not see 75 corruption in the second phase. You'll only see it at the very end of the fight, which we'll talk about when we get there in the final phase. But assuming you did the corrupted realms in a reasonable time period, it takes a very long time to actually get 75 corruption during phase 2 across 3 corrupted realm phases. So most likely you will not see that. Anyway, the corrupted versions of the desecrated weapons are just like they are before, except they're unkillable. So as before, desecrated weapons should slowly be killed off by just random DPS dots here and there, stuff like that. Usually you don't want to focus them because you can kind of just avoid the cloud that they're making. But the corrupted version of a desecrated weapon is unkillable. If you get it to 1 hit point, it will just stay at 1 hit point. And while you're not damaging it, it will slowly gain its health back. And as its health gains back, the radius of the circle that it creates will increase in size back to its maximum range. So effectively, these act as sort of a soft enrage mechanic in that you can eventually get so many around the room that are unkillable, you just wouldn't be able to deal with it, essentially. So again, you probably won't have to worry about these until the very end of the fight, but just be aware that if you hit 75 corruption, the desecrated versions are not killable. So at that point, it just becomes about controlling the space around the room and where they land, rather than killing them off slowly as you would before. So once you push Garrosh to 10% health during phase 2, he will enter his final phase and basically takes on his final form, heals back to 30% health, and this really begins the final push. This phase is the big DPS burn phase. So this ultimately is just like phase 2. Mechanically, it's the same, except that Garrosh automatically goes to 100 corruption or energy, meaning all of his abilities are empowered, including his tank ability, which I didn't talk about before, because you wouldn't hit that until this phase. So let's briefly talk about the tank ability, which is an empowered version, and that's Gripping Despair. So basically, this is a stacking dot on the tank, and this pretty much dictates your tank swaps during this phase. Pretty standard stuff. However, the empowered version causes explosive despair. So effectively, once the tank swap occurs and then the 10-second dot that was on the previous tank expires, it will deal damage to that tank equivalent to the damage of the total dot stack that was on them, essentially. So the best way to think about it is tank's going to need a big cooldown for that. And especially if they're also tanking minions, which you see we are here, because all that stuff still occurs just like it did in phase 2. So this is the time to use Bloodlust a second time. This fight is very long, so even with pretty good DPS, you're probably going to find that you can use Bloodlust at the beginning if you use it in the first phase right away, and then you can use it again in this final phase, which is probably the most efficient way to do it. But effectively, the goal is to burn the boss 30% health before things get out of control. Now, as I said, there's no real reason that you can't handle all the mechanics as you did in phase 2 and just deal with the empowered versions and prolong the phase if you want. But because everything still occurs and the weapons are not killable anymore, so if you wanted to shrink them, you'd have to do DPS to those and all that stuff. We just found it was better to burn the boss down. And this may change in Heroic. I don't know. We'll see. But again, depending on your DPS, you'll have to experiment with a little bit and see what works for you. Ultimately, we found that just ignoring the minions in this phase once the burn begins, letting them sit on the tanks and just trying to heal through it while we DPS the boss down was the best way to go. So there you can see charms going on. We got the desecrated weapons still, all that good stuff. The whirl is obviously very dangerous in this phase as well. So really, as I said, it's just phase 2 again, but everything's empowered. And once you get the boss down to 0%, he is a goner. Spoilers. No. Anyway, so that's it. If I can say such a thing for such a long video. It's a long fight, but as I said, mechanically, it's kind of repetitive. Things pretty much happen the same over and over and over, and you just have to do them 3 or 4, 5, 7, 10 times in a row before you push enough DPS to do the next phase. And then guess what? You do it all again because it's the same mechanics. So, yeah, as I said, the main thing is getting used to those phase 2 abilities. Once you get the pattern down of those and how to handle them, the rest pretty much falls into place. And we went over the strategies in phase 1. You can choose which one works best for your raid and adjust accordingly. But that phase is pretty short. So no matter which you do, you'll get through it pretty quickly. And then most of your time will be spent in the phase 2 section of the fight. So that is Garrosh Hellscream Normal Difficulty Raid Guide. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, and good luck.
Maybe resin?
Yeah. Just waiting for a cooldown to
He's
come up so I
personal.
can ton.
Whirl.
Move
Whirl.
other side, other side.
Desecrate.
Yeah!
Yay!
Yeah!
Boom.
Roll! We got strike?
Whoa.
Yeah, we killed the
We
dudes
did.
with the thing.
Killed so many dudes.
But it says kill 18 with a single
Oh.
iron star.
Lol.
He's dead on blast.